My name is Grace Young. I'm 24 years old, and my mom said my dad left us years ago. But the billionaire's tattoo proved she lied. For my entire life, I believed my father was a coward who abandoned me when I was just a baby. My mom, Elizabeth Young, told me he chose his freedom over us, that he didn't want the responsibility of a family. I carried that pain like a weight on my chest for 24 years, wondering what was so wrong with me that my own father didn't want to stay. But everything I thought I knew shattered one cold Friday night in October when I was serving tables at La Venza, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. I saw a tattoo on a billionaire's wrist that was identical to my mom's, a red rose with thorns twisted into an infinity symbol, and when I asked him about it, he dropped his wine glass, stared at me like he'd seen a ghost, and asked my mother's name. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you love, or if you've ever discovered a secret that changed everything you believed about your life, hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share with you might help you understand that sometimes the biggest lies come from the people trying to protect us. What happened next changed 3 lives forever and proved that sometimes the people we love lie too, protect us from truths they think will hurt more than the lies. The man sitting at table 12 wasn't just any wealthy customer. His name was Adrian Keller, a tech billionaire worth over $2 billion, and he was eating alone in one of the most expensive restaurants in New York City. When he heard my mother's name come out of my mouth, the color drained from his face completely. He left $500 on the table for a meal he barely touched, and he ran out of that restaurant like the building was on fire. I stood there in shock, holding an empty tray, my hands shaking, while my manager yelled at me for breaking protocol by talking to a VIP guest. But I couldn't stop thinking about one question that burned in my mind all night long. Who was Adrian Keller, and why did he react like that when he heard my mother's name? That night, I couldn't sleep because my entire world had just tilted on its axis, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my head, the way his hand froze in midair, the way the wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered across the white tablecloth like blood spreading across snow. The way he looked at me with eyes that were the exact same shade of green as mine. I had spent 24 years hating a father I thought abandoned me, working double shifts to pay my dying mother's medical bills, sacrificing my own dreams because that's what you do when you're all someone has left in the world. But now I had seen something that didn't make sense, something that suggested maybe, just maybe, the story I'd been told my whole life wasn't the whole truth. And I was terrified of what I might discover if I kept digging. Let me take you back to the beginning so you can understand just how devastating this discovery really was for me. I grew up in a small apartment in Queens with just my mom and me, no dad. No extended family, no one else. My mom worked as a cleaning lady for rich families in Manhattan, scrubbing their toilets and washing their floors for barely enough money to keep us fed. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, leaving before I woke up for school and coming home after I'd already gone to bed. If you grew up with a single parent who sacrificed everything for you, drop a like on this video and subscribe, because you know exactly what I'm talking about, that guilt you feel watching them work themselves to death, while you can't do anything to help. I watched my mom age 20 years in the span of 10, her hands becoming rough and scarred, her back permanently bent from years of hard labor. Whenever I asked about my father, my mom's face would go blank like a door slamming shut, and she'd give me the same answer every single time. He left us when you were 6 months old, Grace. He said he wasn't ready to be a father. He chose himself over us. That was it. No details, no stories, no photographs, nothing. Just that cold, hard statement that my father was a man who didn't want me. The only clue I ever had was the tattoo on my mom's left wrist, that beautiful red rose with thorns wrapped around it in the shape of an infinity symbol. When I was little, I used to trace it with my fingers and ask her what it meant. She'd pull her hand away gently and say, "It's about someone who doesn't matter anymore, baby. Don't worry about it." But it clearly mattered to her because she never covered it up, never had it removed, even though I could see the pain in her eyes every time she looked at it. Growing up without a father created a hole in my chest that never healed, no matter how hard I tried to fill it with other things. I watched other kids get picked up from school by their dads, saw families at restaurants with mothers and fathers laughing together, and I felt that absence like a physical wound. I was angry at a man I'd never met, angry at the universe for giving me a mother who worked herself to death and a father who didn't care enough to stay. By the time I turned 18, I'd built a wall around that pain and told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need a father anyway. But then, 6 months ago, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months to live, maybe less. And suddenly, I was working double shifts as a waitress to pay for her medical bills because she had no insurance, no savings, nothing. I dropped out of community college, gave up my tiny studio apartment, and moved back home to take care of her while she slowly died in that same small apartment where I grew up. That's where my life was when I served Adrian Keller at table 12 and everything I thought I knew exploded into a million pieces. Let me tell you about that Friday night in October that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. It was cold outside, one of those autumn nights in New York where the wind cuts through your jacket and makes you wish you were anywhere else but on the street. Lavenza was packed with the usual Friday crowd, executives celebrating deals, celebrities trying to avoid attention, and wealthy couples spending more on one meal than I made in a month. My manager, a strict woman named Patricia, who never smiled, pulled me aside around 8 p.m. and told me I was serving table 12, a VIP who had specifically requested privacy and discretion. If you've ever worked in the service industry and had to deal with difficult customers or impossible situations, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because you know that sinking feeling in your stomach when your boss gives you a table that could either make or break your night. I grabbed my notepad, took a deep breath, and walked toward the corner booth where a man sat alone, looking at the menu with sad eyes. The first thing I noticed about Adrian Keller was how lonely he looked, despite all the obvious signs of wealth. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire year's rent, a watch that gleamed gold on his wrist, and he had that particular posture of someone who is used to being important. But his eyes were different. They looked tired, sad, like he was carrying some invisible weight that no amount of money could lift. He barely looked up when I approached to take his drink order, just quietly asked for a bottle of wine whose name I couldn't even pronounce. I poured his water, set down the wine, went through my professional routine like I had 1,000 times before. That's when everything changed. When I reached across to adjust his napkin, his sleeve moved up just an inch, and I saw it clearly under the dim restaurant lighting. A red rose with thorns twisted into an infinity symbol, exactly like the tattoo on my mother's wrist. My hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped the water pitcher right there on the expensive white tablecloth. I stared at that tattoo like it was a ghost, like it was something impossible that shouldn't exist in reality. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears I could barely hear the restaurant noise around me, the clinking glasses, the quiet conversations, the soft jazz playing in the background. Every professional instinct told me to stay quiet, to walk away, to mind my own business like Patricia had drilled into us during training. But I couldn't. I physically could not walk away from that table without knowing the truth. So I did something I'd never done before in 2 years of working at Lavenza. I broke protocol completely. I looked at this billionaire stranger sitting alone at table 12, and with my voice shaking, I asked the question that would blow up 3 lives. Sir, this is going to sound strange, but my mother has a tattoo exactly like that one. What does it mean? What happened next felt like it was happening in slow motion, like time itself had stopped to witness this impossible moment. Adrian Keller froze completely, and I mean completely, like someone had hit pause on a video. The wineglass was halfway to his lips, suspended in midair, and his green eyes went wide with something I couldn't identify at first. Shock, fear, recognition. His mouth opened slightly but no words came out, and I watched the color literally drain from his face until he looked almost gray under the warm restaurant lighting. Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He asked me a question in a voice that was barely a whisper, a voice that trembled with an emotion so raw, it made me take a step back. "What's your mother's name?" said, and I could see his hands starting to shake just like mine were. When I answered Elizabeth Yon, the wineglass fell from his hand and everything exploded into chaos. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the quiet restaurant like a gunshot, making every head turn toward our corner. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood, dripping onto his expensive suit, pooling around the broken crystal shards that caught the light like tiny diamonds. Adrian didn't seem to notice or care. He was staring at me with an intensity that made me feel like he was looking straight through me into my soul. His breathing became heavy, almost panicked, and he gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "How old are you?" he asked, his voice breaking. 24, I answered, confused and scared. He asked me again, "How old are you?" Like he hadn't heard me the first time. Then a third time, his voice rising. "How old are you?" I repeated my age, and I watched something break inside him right there in front of me. If you're still watching and you want to know what he said next, hit that subscribe button now, because what happened in the next 60 seconds changed absolutely everything. Patricia rushed over with napkins and apologies, trying to clean up the mess and calm down our VIP guest, but Adrian was already standing up, moving like a man who'd just been told the world was ending. He pulled out his wallet with shaking hands, threw 5 $100 bills on the wine-soaked table, and looked at me one more time with eyes that were filling with tears. I wanted to ask him what was happening, wanted to demand answers, wanted to understand why a simple question about a tattoo had caused this complete breakdown. But before I could say anything, he turned and ran toward the exit, pushing past other diners, leaving behind his uneaten meal and a restaurant full of confused people staring at the chaos. I stood there frozen, holding my notepad, my mind racing with 1,000 questions and 0 answers. Patricia was furious, yelling at me about professionalism and boundaries, threatening to fire me on the spot. But I barely heard her because all I could think about was the look on Adrian Keller's face when he heard my mother's name, like he'd just seen a ghost. Like I'd just told him something that shattered his entire world just as completely as it was about to shatter mine. The next day, I couldn't think about anything except that strange encounter with Adrian Keller, and the way he ran out of the restaurant like I'd just destroyed his world. I finished my morning shift on autopilot, barely remembering the orders I took or the customers I served, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. After work, I took the subway to Mount Sinai Hospital, where my mom had been staying for the past 3 weeks, room 407 in the oncology ward. The ride felt longer than usual, my stomach twisting with anxiety because I knew I had to ask her about Adrian, but I had no idea what I was going to say or how she would react. If you've ever had to confront someone you love about a lie they told you, leave a like and subscribe, because you know that terrible feeling in your gut when you're about to ask a question that might change everything between you forever. When I walked into her hospital room, the smell of disinfectant and sickness hit me like it always did, making my eyes water. My mom looked so small and fragile in that hospital bed, her head completely bald from the chemotherapy, her skin pale and almost transparent under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was awake, staring out the window at the New York skyline, and when she turned to smile at me, I saw how thin she'd become, her cheekbones sharp, her arms like sticks, her body being eaten away by the cancer that was slowly killing her. I sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chair next to her bed, held her cold hand, and tried to figure out how to ask the question that was burning in my chest. Finally, I just said it as casually as I could manage. "Mom, do you know someone named Adrian Keller?" The reaction was instant and terrifying. All the color drained from her face, her hand started shaking in mine, and tears immediately filled her eyes before I'd even finished saying his name. She pulled her hand away from mine and covered her mouth with both hands, her whole body starting to tremble like she was having some kind of panic attack. "Why do you know that name?" she whispered, her voice breaking with fear and something else I couldn't identify. Hope. Grief. I told her everything that had happened the night before at the restaurant. The tattoo, the wine glass shattering, the way he ran out after hearing her name, the $500 he left on the table. As I talked, my mom started crying harder, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that made the heart monitor beat faster. "He found me," she said through her tears, speaking more to herself than to me. "After all these years, after everything, he finally found me." I felt anger rising in my chest because none of this made sense. Who was this man? And why was my dying mother crying over someone who was supposed to be a stranger? I grabbed her hand again, harder this time, and demanded the truth I should have gotten 24 years ago. "Mom, who is Adrian Keller, and what does he have to do with us?" What my mom told me next was a love story that had been buried for 25 years, hidden under layers of pain and misunderstanding and terrible timing. She told me that she met Adrian Keller in the summer of 1999 when they were both young and broke and new to New York City. He was 23 years old, a German immigrant who had come to America with nothing but a dream and a work visa, doing construction jobs to survive. She was 22, fresh from Italy, working as a nanny for a wealthy family on the Upper East Side, and living in a tiny room in their basement. They met at a street fair in Brooklyn, started talking, and fell in love so fast and so hard that within 3 months they were inseparable. The kind of love that feels like it's going to last forever. The kind that makes you believe in fate and destiny and soulmates. My mom's voice got soft and distant as she told me about those days, like she was traveling back in time to a version of herself that I'd never known existed. They were poor but happy, she said, eating cheap pizza for dinner and walking across the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset because they couldn't afford dates at restaurants. In March of 2000, they got matching tattoos, the red rose with infinity thorns, as a promise that their love would last forever, that nothing could separate them. But then, just 2 weeks after getting those tattoos, my mom's grandmother in Italy had a massive stroke, and she had to fly home immediately to help take care of her. Adrian couldn't come with her because he couldn't afford to lose his construction job or risk his visa status. They both cried at the airport, and he promised he would wait for her, that he would save money so they could be together forever, that nothing would change. She promised to come back in 6 months, and they believed with all their hearts that their love was strong enough to survive the distance and the time apart. But life had other plans, and sometimes fate is cruel in ways you can't predict or control. When my mom finally returned to New York in October of 2000, everything had changed in ways she never could have imagined. She went to the apartment where Adrian had been living on Mott Street in Little Italy, but the landlord told her he had moved out in September. No forwarding address, no phone number, nothing. She tried calling the old number she had for him, but it was disconnected. She went to the construction company where he used to work, but they said he'd quit months ago and they didn't know where he went. For 2 desperate weeks, she searched for him all over the city, asking mutual friends they used to hang out with, checking their favorite spots, even going back to that street fair in Brooklyn where they first met. But Adrian Keller had vanished completely, and my mom eventually convinced herself that he had moved on, found someone else, forgotten about her and the promises they made. She believed he had abandoned her, just like she would later tell me that my father had abandoned us, because in her mind, that's exactly what he did when he disappeared without a trace. What my mom told me next made my entire world collapse in a way I never could have imagined or prepared myself for. She took a shaky breath, wiped the tears from her face with her hospital gown, and told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about myself and my existence. When she flew back to Italy in March of 2000 to take care of her dying grandmother, she didn't know she was pregnant with me. She found out 6 weeks later when she started feeling sick and went to a doctor in her small Italian village. She was terrified, alone, and desperate to tell Adrian, so she tried calling him over and over again, but his number was already disconnected. If you're watching this and you've ever felt completely alone during the hardest moment of your life, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what my mom went through for the next 7 months was something no one should ever have to face by themselves. She wrote letters to his old address on Mott Street, but they all came back marked return to sender, because he had already moved. She tried contacting the construction company where he worked, but they told her he quit and they had no forwarding information. By the time she flew back to New York in October of 2000, she was 7 months pregnant, scared, broke, and still searching for the man she loved. She went to his apartment building with her swollen belly and knocked on the door. But a different family was living there now. The landlord told her Adrian had moved out in September, just 1 month before she came back, and he didn't leave any contact information. She searched for 2 more weeks, waddling through the streets of New York with her pregnant belly, asking anyone who might have known him, checking every place they used to go together. But Adrian Keller had disappeared like he never existed. And my mom was left with nothing but an infinity tattoo on her wrist, and a baby growing inside her that would never know her father. In March of 2001, she gave birth to me in that same hospital where she's dying now, Mount Sinai, completely alone without anyone holding her hand or telling her everything would be okay. She named me Grace because she said I was the only grace she had left in a world that had taken everything else away from her. And she made a decision that would define both of our lives for the next 24 years. She decided to tell me that my father had abandoned us because she genuinely believed that's what happened. She convinced herself that Adrian must have met someone else, fallen out of love with her, moved away to start a new life without her. She thought it would hurt me less to believe my father never knew about me than to believe he knew and chose not to care. So she created a story about a man who left when I was 6 months old. A man who chose freedom over family. A man who never wanted to be a father. And I grew up hating a ghost, resenting someone who never even knew I existed. Carrying anger toward a man who loved my mother so much he got a tattoo promising forever. I left my mom's hospital room in a daze. Walked down the long white corridor, past nurses and doctors and other families dealing with their own tragedies, and somehow made it to the parking garage before my legs gave out completely. I collapsed against someone's car in the dimly lit parking structure and broke down in a way I'd never broken down before in my entire life. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, my history, all of it, was built on a foundation of misunderstanding and terrible timing. And to people who loved each other but could never find their way back. My father didn't abandon me because he didn't even know I existed. The man I'd spent 24 years hating. The ghost I blamed for every hard moment in my childhood. For every time my mom cried herself to sleep. For every sacrifice she made working 3 jobs that man never chose to leave us. He was just a guy who moved apartments at the worst possible time in human history. And that single decision created a ripple effect that destroyed 3 lives for a quarter of a century. I felt so many emotions at once, I thought I might actually lose my mind right there in that parking garage. I was angry at my mom for lying to me my whole life, even though I understood why she did it. I was angry at the universe for its cruel timing. If Adrian had moved 1 month later, if my mom had come back 1 month earlier, if cell phones had been common in 2000, if social media had existed, none of this would have happened. I was angry at myself for all the years I spent judging a father I never met, for the resentment I carried, for the hole I felt in my heart that was actually filled the whole time but I just didn't know it. But more than anger, I felt grief for the childhood I could have had with a father. Grief for my mom who raised me alone when she didn't have to. Grief for Adrian who spent 25 years not knowing he had a daughter. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of that parking garage and cried until I had no tears left. Until my body was completely empty of everything except exhaustion and confusion. The biggest shock was realizing that my entire identity was based on a story that wasn't true. I had always seen myself as the abandoned child, the girl whose father didn't want her, the daughter who had to be strong because her mom was all she had. That story shaped every decision I made, every relationship I built. Every wall I put up around my heart to protect myself from being left again. But now I was someone completely different. I was the daughter of a man who never knew about me. The child of a love story that got interrupted by bad luck and miscommunication. Somewhere in New York City, there was a billionaire who had spent the last 48 hours processing the same shock I was processing now. A man who probably looked at me in that restaurant and saw the child he never got to raise. The daughter he never knew existed. And I had no idea what to do with that information. No idea how to process the fact that I had a father who might actually want to know me, who might have wanted me all along if he'd only known I was alive. I sat in that parking garage for 2 hours trying to figure out who Grace Young really was, now that the story of Grace Young had completely changed. 2 days after that conversation with my mom, I was working my usual morning shift at Lavenza, when Patricia told me someone was asking for me at the front entrance. I walked out to the lobby and found a man in an expensive gray suit holding a leather briefcase, looking completely out of place among the breakfast customers. He introduced himself as Thomas Warren, a corporate attorney who represented Adrian Keller, and asked if we could talk somewhere private for a few minutes. My heart started racing because I knew whatever he was about to say would change everything again. If you're still watching this story and you want to know what Adrian's lawyer told me, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Because what happened next was the moment when I had to decide whether to let this man into our lives or protect my dying mother from more heartbreak. Thomas led me to a quiet corner near the coat check and explained that Adrian had spent the last 48 hours processing everything, doing the math, checking dates, and he was absolutely certain that I was his daughter. Thomas spoke carefully, like he was walking through a minefield of emotions, explaining that Adrian had been devastated when he learned the truth. He told me that Adrian never moved on, never married, spent 25 years building a technology empire but never building a family because he never found what he had with my mom. When Adrian moved apartments in September of 2000, it was because he got a better job with a tech startup and needed to be closer to the office. He worked 18-hour days for months trying to save enough money to eventually go to Italy and find my mom, or bring her back permanently. He had no idea she'd already come back to New York looking for him while he was buried in work. Thomas pulled out some documents from his briefcase and showed me photos of Adrian from those years, a younger version of the man I'd met, holding that same sad expression, and in every single photo, I could see the tattoo on his wrist. He wanted to meet my mom, Thomas said. He wanted to meet me properly, and he wanted to do a DNA test to confirm what he already knew in his heart was true. I felt torn in 1,000 directions because part of me wanted to slam the door on this entire situation and protect what was left of my small, broken family. My mom was dying. She had maybe 4 months left according to the doctors, and I didn't want some billionaire stranger walking in and disrupting her final days with complicated emotions and old wounds. But another part of me, the part that had always wondered about my father, the part that felt that instant connection when I looked into Adrian's green eyes, wanted to know him. I told Thomas that I needed conditions if this was going to happen. Adrian had to understand that my mom was very sick and didn't have time for games or drama. He had to be serious about this, not just curious. And if he did anything at all to hurt my mom or make her feel worse than she already did, I would never forgive him, and he would never see either of us again. Thomas nodded, wrote down everything I said, and promised that Adrian understood the gravity of the situation. We scheduled the DNA test for the next day, and I walked back into the restaurant, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would either save us all or destroy what little we had left. 3 days later, after the DNA samples were collected and sent to the lab, Adrian asked through Thomas if he could visit my mom at the hospital. The results wouldn't come back for another few days, but he said he couldn't wait. He needed to see her, needed to know she was real, needed to explain what happened 25 years ago. I agreed but told him I wanted to meet him first, alone, before he saw my mom. So we arranged to meet in the hospital cafeteria at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, and I sat at a corner table drinking terrible coffee and watching the door like my life depended on it. When Adrian walked in, I felt my breath catch in my throat, because now that I was looking for it, I could see myself in him, the shape of my face, the color of my eyes, the way he walked with his shoulders slightly forward like he was carrying invisible weight. He spotted me immediately, walked over slowly like he was afraid I might disappear, and sat down across from me with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, two strangers who shared DNA, trying to figure out how to start a conversation that was 24 years overdue. Finally, I broke the silence and told him that my mom was very sick, that she didn't look like she probably did when he knew her, that the cancer had taken almost everything from her except her memories. Adrian's eyes filled with tears, and he said, "I don't care what she looks like. I just need to see her. I've been looking for her for 25 years. That's when I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind since that night at the restaurant. Why did you move? Why did you disappear right when she came back? He explained that he got offered a job at a tech startup in September 2000, and it was the first real opportunity he'd had since coming to America. He was making barely enough to survive on construction, and this new job paid 3 times as much. He moved to a different apartment, closer to the office in Tribeca, started working 80-hour weeks, and was saving every penny because his plan was to surprise my mom by showing up in Italy with enough money to support them both, or bring her back to America permanently. He never imagined she was already back in New York looking for him while he was drowning in code and deadlines just a few miles away. If you've made it this far in my story, please subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what happens when Adrian finally sees my mom after 25 years is something you won't want to miss. The cruelty of the timing hit both of us at the same time, and we just sat there in that hospital cafeteria, surrounded by doctors and patients and families, 2 people connected by blood and separated by the worst luck in the universe. I asked him about his life, about the company he built, about why he never married or had other children. Adrian told me that after my mom left for Italy, he threw himself into work as a way to cope with missing her. He taught himself computer programming, got hired by that startup, and when it went public in 2005, he became wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined. But every relationship he tried after my mom felt empty, like he was just going through the motions with people who weren't her. He said he kept the tattoo as a reminder of the one time in his life when he felt complete, even though it hurt to look at it. In 2010, he hired private investigators to find her. But Elizabeth Young was such a common name, and without social media profiles or any digital footprint, they came up empty. He never stopped looking, he just ran out of places to search. Now, sitting across from me, he was looking at a 24-year-old woman who had his eyes in his mother's smile. And I watched him realize in real time that he'd missed everything. My first steps, my first day of school, my graduation, every birthday, every moment that makes up a childhood. The grief on his face was so raw and real that I reached across the table and held his hand. And for the first time in my life, I held my father's hand and told him it wasn't too late to be part of my life, even if we couldn't get back the years we'd lost. After that conversation in the hospital cafeteria, Adrian went up to room 47 to see my mom, and I gave them privacy because that reunion belonged to them, not to me. I sat in the waiting area for over an hour, listening to the sounds of the hospital beeping machine, quiet conversations, footsteps echoing down hallways, while to people who loved each other 25 years ago, tried to make sense of what happened to their lives. When Adrian finally came out, his eyes were red and swollen from crying, and he looked at me with a mixture of grief and hope that broke my heart all over again. The next day, we all went to a medical lab to do the DNA test. Adrian, me, and a technician who swabbed the inside of our cheeks and put the samples in sealed containers that would determine our future. If you've ever had to wait for test results that could change your entire life, hit that like button and subscribe. Because the next 3 days were the longest, most agonizing days I've ever experienced. And I want to know if you've ever felt that same kind of torture waiting for answers that could change everything. The waiting was unbearable because every possible outcome played through my mind like a movie on repeat. What if the test came back negative, and this was all just a coincidence? Just to people who happened to get the same tattoo, and happened to know each other 25 years ago. What if I'd gotten my hopes up for nothing? What if I'd let my dying mother believe in a love story that was just a cruel trick of fate? But then another voice in my head said, what if it's positive? What if Adrian really is my father? And suddenly I have to figure out how to build a relationship with someone I've only known for a week? What if he expects me to be someone I'm not? What if I disappoint him? What if having a father is nothing like I imagined it would be? I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except that phone call from the lab that would either confirm or destroy the story my mom had told me in her hospital bed. I worked my shifts at the restaurant like a zombie, going through the motions. And Patricia kept asking if I was okay, because I'd dropped 3 plates and spilled coffee on 2 customers in one day. During those 3 days, Adrian visited my mom every single day, sometimes twice a day, like he was trying to make up for 25 years in 72 hours. He brought her flowers, pink roses, her favorite, which he somehow remembered from 1999. He brought her books to read, a soft blanket because the hospital ones were scratchy, and he just sat with her, holding her hand, talking about the old days when they were young and poor and in love. I watched them together through the window of her hospital room, and I could see the way they looked at each other like no time had passed at all, like they were still those 22 and 23-year-old kids who got matching tattoos and believed love could conquer anything. My mom's face looked different when he was there, younger somehow, lighter, like the weight she'd been carrying for 25 years had finally been lifted off her shoulders. And I realized that no matter what the DNA test said, Adrian had already changed our lives just by walking back into them. Just by proving that my mom's love story wasn't a tragedy after all. Just a story that got interrupted and was finally getting a chance to continue. On the 3rd day, Thomas called me at work and asked me to come to his office downtown because the results were ready. I took the subway with shaking hands, walked into that fancy law office with its marble floors and expensive art on the walls, and sat across from Thomas and Adrian in a conference room that probably costs more to rent for an hour than I made in a month. Thomas opened a manila envelope, pulled out a document with official letterhead and lots of scientific words I didn't understand, and then said the sentence that would change my entire identity. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. Adrian Keller is Grace Young's biological father. The room went completely silent, except for the sound of Adrian sobbing deep, gut-wrenching sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside him that I felt them in my own chest. I just sat there, frozen, staring at that piece of paper that confirmed what we'd all somehow known but needed science to prove. If you're still watching this emotional journey and you want to know what happened after we got the results, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because what Adrian did next showed me what it really means to have a father who loves you. Adrian didn't waste a single second once we had that confirmation in our hands. Within 24 hours, my mom was transferred from Mount Sinai to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one of the best cancer hospitals in the entire world, with a private room that looked more like a hotel suite than a hospital. He hired the top oncologists in the country, doctors who specialized in pancreatic cancer and had access to experimental treatments that weren't covered by regular insurance. He paid off every single medical bill my mom had accumulated, over $200,000 of debt that had been crushing both of us, and he did it without even blinking. Like it was nothing. Like money was just paper and her life was everything that mattered. But more than the money, more than the fancy hospital room or the expensive doctors, what changed everything was that he showed up. Every morning at 8 a.m., Adrian was in my mom's room with coffee and breakfast, and he stayed until she fell asleep at night. He read to her when she was too tired to hold a book. He held her hand during painful treatments. He made her laugh with stories about the early days of his tech company, when everything was chaos and nobody knew what they were doing. And then there was me. Suddenly I had a father who wanted to know everything about the 24 years he'd missed. Adrian took me to dinner at restaurants I could never afford, not to show off his money but just to have uninterrupted time to talk and learn about each other. He asked about my childhood, about my favorite subjects in school, about the dreams I'd given up when my mom got sick, about the life I'd lived without him. I told him about growing up in Queens, about watching my mom work herself to exhaustion, about the anger I'd carried thinking he abandoned us, about dropping out of community college to work double shifts at the restaurant. His face crumpled with pain when I talked about the hard times, and I could see the guilt eating him alive, guilt for not being there, even though it wasn't his fault, even though he didn't know I existed. But I also told him that my mom did an amazing job raising me alone, that I turned out okay despite everything, and that having him now, even if it was 24 years late, meant more to me than he could ever understand. For the first time in my life, I looked across a dinner table and saw my father looking back at me, and I realized that family isn't just about biology or timing, it's about showing up when it matters, even if you're late, and choosing to love someone even when you missed the beginning of their story. A few weeks after Adrian came back into our lives, I realized I needed to have a hard conversation with my mom about the lies she'd told me for 24 years. We were sitting in her new private room at Sloan Kettering, with its big windows overlooking the East River and furniture that actually looked comfortable instead of institutional, and I could see she was getting stronger on the new treatment protocol Adrian's doctors had put her on. The color was slowly coming back to her cheeks, and she could sit up in bed without help now, which felt like a miracle after months of watching her fade away. But I still had this anger sitting in my chest like a stone, this feeling that she had stolen something from me by lying about my father, and I knew I couldn't move forward until I understood why she did it. If you've ever had to forgive someone who hurt you even though they thought they were protecting you, please hit that subscribe button, because what my mom told me that day changed how I understood love and sacrifice and the impossible choices parents make when they're trying to keep their children from pain. I asked her directly why she never told me the truth, why she let me grow up believing my father abandoned me instead of telling me he simply didn't know I existed. My mom started crying before she even answered, and her hands were shaking as she tried to find the words to explain. 24 years of decisions that seemed right at the time, but turned out to be so wrong. She told me that when she came back to New York in 2000, 7 months pregnant and desperate to find Adrian, and discovered he had vanished without a trace, she felt more rejected and abandoned than she'd ever felt in her entire life. She convinced herself that he must have met someone else, must have fallen out of love with her, must have deliberately moved away to avoid her. She spent 2 weeks searching for him while her pregnant belly grew bigger, feeling more humiliated and heartbroken with each dead end, until she finally accepted what she thought was the truth, that Adrian didn't love her anymore and didn't want to be found. But the real reason she lied to me, she explained through tears, wasn't about her own pain, it was about mine. She said that when I was old enough to start asking about my father, she had to make a choice about what story to tell me. She could tell me the truth, that my father didn't know I existed because he disappeared before she could tell him she was pregnant, but she thought that truth would make me feel even worse, would make me wonder my whole life if he would have wanted me, if he'd known, if he would have stayed, if he'd been given the chance, if I was worth fighting for. She thought it would be kinder to tell me he left after I was born, that he knew about me and chose to leave anyway, because at least then, I wouldn't spend my childhood wondering if I was wanted. I thought it would hurt less to believe your father made a choice to leave than to believe he never got the chance to choose you, she said, sobbing. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But I was 23 years old, alone, terrified, and I thought I was protecting you from a pain that would be worse than the abandonment story. I thought I was being a good mother. 4 months after Adrian came back into our lives, my mom's oncologist called us all into his office with news that seemed impossible given where we'd started. The experimental immunotherapy treatment that Adrian had paid for, a cutting-edge triple combination therapy that was only available through a clinical trial at Sloan Kettering, had worked beyond anyone's expectations. The tumors in my mom's pancreas had shrunk by 67%. The metastases in her liver were completely gone, and her cancer markers were dropping every week. Dr. Richardson, the lead oncologist, used the word we'd been afraid to even think about: remission. My mom was in remission from stage 4 pancreatic cancer, a disease that usually kills within 6 months, and she might have years instead of weeks. If you've stuck with me through this entire emotional journey, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next proved that sometimes love really does get a second chance. Even after 25 years of being lost, the day we got the remission news, Adrian did something I'll never forget as long as I live. He dropped to one knee right there in the hospital room, in front of me and Dr. Richardson and 2 nurses who had just walked in to check vitals, and he pulled out a ring that looked like it belonged in a museum. He told my mom that he should have asked her this question 25 years ago, that he should have married her before she left for Italy, that every day without her had been incomplete, and that he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Elizabeth Young, will you marry me? He asked, with tears streaming down his face. Will you let me spend whatever time we have left, whether it's months or years or decades, being your husband? My mom was crying so hard she couldn't speak. She could only nod yes over and over again. Well, I stood in the corner of the room sobbing, and the nurses were wiping their own eyes, and Dr. Richardson was pretending to look at his clipboard, so we wouldn't see him getting emotional too. They got married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the hospital chapel because my mom wasn't strong enough yet to leave Sloan Kettering for long periods. It was the smallest, simplest wedding you could imagine, just me serving as my mom's maid of honor, Thomas the lawyer as Adrian's best man, a handful of close friends, and the entire nursing staff from the oncology floor who had been taking care of my mom and had fallen in love with her story. My mom wore a simple white dress that Adrian had bought for her, and she looked more beautiful than I'd ever seen her, even without hair, even with an IV port still in her chest, even with all the physical marks that cancer had left on her body. Adrian wore a dark suit and cried through his entire vows, promising to love her in sickness and in health, to make up for every single day they'd lost, to never let her go again for as long as they both lived. When they kissed, I watched my parents, 2 people who loved each other 25 years ago, and never stopped loving each other, even when they thought they'd lost each other forever, finally become a family. And I realized, standing there in that hospital chapel, watching them hold each other like they were afraid the other might disappear again, that my broken family was finally complete. Not in the traditional way, not in the timing anyone would have chosen, but complete in the way that mattered most, with love that survived terrible timing, cruel luck, and 25 years of separation, and came back stronger than ever, because real love doesn't die just because life gets in the way. 2 years have passed since that cold October night when I saw Adrian's tattoo, and my entire world changed forever. And I can honestly say that my life now looks nothing like I ever imagined it would. My mom is still alive, living in a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn with Adrian, going to regular checkups where the doctors keep using words like stable and long-term remission that once seemed impossible for stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I went back to college and I'm studying to become a social worker because I want to help other families find each other the way we found each other. And I don't have to work double shifts anymore because Adrian paid for my tuition and made sure I could focus on my education instead of survival. My relationship with my father is still a work in progress. We're learning each other, building trust, creating new memories to make up for the 24 years we lost. But every Sunday we have dinner together as a family. And when I look at my parents sitting next to each other, with their matching tattoos visible, I see living proof that love doesn't die just because life gets complicated. It just waits for the right moment to come back stronger than before. The lie my mom told me doesn't define our relationship anymore because I understand now that she wasn't trying to hurt me. She was a terrified 23-year-old single mother who made the best decision she could with the information she had, trying to protect her daughter from a pain she thought would be unbearable. Sometimes the lies people tell us are just truths they couldn't see clearly, truths that got twisted by bad timing and impossible circumstances. And forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about understanding why it happened and choosing love anyway. Choosing to believe that people do the best they can with what they know at the time, and choosing to move forward together instead of staying stuck in the past. Have you ever discovered a family secret that completely changed how you saw your life, your identity, or the people you thought you knew? Share your story in the comments because I promised you're not alone. And if you want to hear more about how I learned to forgive my mom for the lie she told, how I built a real relationship with the father I thought I'd never have, and how our broken family became whole again despite terrible odds, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. In my next video, I'll tell you about the moment I realized my mom wasn't just a liar who stole my father from me. She was actually my hero who carried the weight of an impossible secret alone for 24 years while raising me with nothing but love, sacrifice, and a strength I'm only now beginning to understand.